In 1953, this man, Antonio Enauro, moved a motion for self-governance. That motion will kickstart the chain of events that compelled the British to eventually hand over power on the 1st of October 1960. With this, ended a tortuous journey that started with the annexation of Lagos in 1861. This is the darkest shade in the history of modern Nigeria, and the effect of some of the atrocities of this era persist in our country up until now. Which begs the question, should Britain pay reparations for colonizing Nigeria in the first place? Should Britain apologize for inflicting on us so many aberrations? We're talking about constant ethnic and tribal conflict, economic and resource exploitation, collapse of socio-cultural institutions, loss of culture and identity, and the chief of them all, the harrowing experience of slave trade. This is a question we must answer, a debate we must have, and it's polarizing. So let's take a look at the gray areas. So to start with, let's define what reparation is. According to dictionary.com, reparation is the action of making amends for a wrong one has done by providing payment and other assistance to those who have been wronged. Now that is out of the way, let's get started. Of all reasons why Britain should pay reparation and apologize to Nigeria as a former colony, the slave trade phenomenon reigned supreme. You see, ivory, gold, and other trade resources attracted Europeans to West Africa. And as demand for cheap labor to work on plantations in Europe grew, enslaved people in West Africa became the most valuable commodity for the European traders. Now let's be clear. Slavery does exist in Africa before the Europeans arrived. I mean, kingdoms and empires would often wage war against each other and take prisoners of war from their conquest. However, with the Europeans, things got messier. Their demand for slave labor was so immense, so much that traders and their agents would set from the coastal areas far into the inland, ravaging settlements, towns, and kingdoms, and devastating the region. The demand compelled the supply. Powerful African leaders were induced into the practice by exchanging enslaved people for goods such as alcohol, beads, and clothes. Now, many would argue that this was an act fostered by private individuals and merchants. True, it did start with them, but the kingdom and the crown directly stamped it afterwards. According to a Guardian UK report, Queen Elizabeth I believed that capturing Africans against their will would be detestable and call down the vengeance of heaven upon the undertakers. That's what she said. That sounds noble, right? But here's the catch. After seeing the huge profits available from slave trade, she lent royal ships to two slaving expeditions of this man, John Hawkins, the first English trader of enslaved people from West Africa. With this, Britain became the world's leading slave trading country, building its society and its economy from the rules of the trade. This is known as the transatlantic slave trade. 1/5 of the elites in Britain in the 19th century owed their wealth to the slave economy. And how big is this economy? Here are some numbers. All put together, around 12 million Africans were enslaved in the course of the transatlantic slave trade. Britain alone accounts for 28% of this, 28%. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported about 3.4 million Africans across the Atlantic. These people, in their millions, were forced to embark on a harrowing voyage in European ships. In fact, there's a term for it. It's called the Middle Passage. The conditions on board these ships were appalling. Huge numbers of people were crammed into very small spaces. Men, women, and children were separated. Families were torn apart. Overcrowding, poor diet, dehydration, and disease led to high death rates. According to a Greenwich Royal Museum report, 450,000 of the 3.4 million Africans transported in British ships died on the Atlantic crossing. Those who resisted by refusing food and water were beaten and force-fed. Attempts at more violent and organized rebellion were even more savagely punished. Some people preferred death to slavery and then committed suicide during the voyage. This reminds me of this iconic line in the film Black Panther. It was said by the antagonist Eric Killmonger. He says,
"Just bury me in the ocean with my ancestors that jumped from the ships, because they knew death was better than bondage."
So they died. The act to abolish slave trade would not be passed in the British Parliament until 1807. Even at that, the institution of slavery carried on as before until the Parliament again passed an Emancipation Act in 1833. Guess what? Full emancipation was not realized until 5 years later in 1838. But you know what the Parliament also did? They voted to pay £20 million in compensation, not to the enslaved or their descendants, but to slave owners. How ironic. And you would have to know this point because we'll come back to it later. You see, people like Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce embarked on a lot of sensitization campaigns across Britain before slave trade could be abolished. Meanwhile, some other people believed that the only way to eradicate slavery was to promote legitimate trade and European forms of religion and government in Africa. And this paved the way for another reason why Britain should pay reparation and apologize to Nigeria. That's the colonial rule of the later part of the 18th century and the half of the 19th century. And this is how it happened. You see, the outright enslavement of Africa gave way for what is now known as the Scramble for Africa. It all began with the Berlin Conference of 1884. At that time, it was called the Africa Conference, just that there were no Africans at the table. It was a meeting where the European powers at the time sat down and divided the continent on the map for themselves to conquer, colonize, and more importantly, take note of this, more importantly, exercise effective control. Essentially, that means that wherever any of these countries colonized and was able to maintain a stern grip on, the other country cannot attempt to overthrow. Therefore, it was in the best occupying interest of the colonizer to, by hook or crook, maintain a firm grip on the colony. Kill, maim, assault, imprison, do whatever you like, just ensure that you terrify them into submission. None mastered the art and the act of this more than the British Empire. And how did they do this? It's through the brutal invasions. The British led a series of military campaigns to enlarge its sphere of influence and expand its commercial opportunities from the south to the north of Nigeria. The superior weapons and military tactics of the British gave them an edge over the locals who were often taken by surprise. In 1851, the Royal Navy bombarded Lagos and ousted King Kosoko and established a treaty with the new installed King Akitoye, who was expectedly more tilted to the British interest. Lagos was annexed as a crown colony in 1861 via the Treaty of Concession. This is a treaty that states that Lagos now belongs to the British Crown. In 1892, the British Armed Forces set out to fight the Ijebu Kingdom, which had resisted missionaries and foreign traders. Although the Ijebu had some weapons, they were wiped out by the British Maxim guns. That's the earliest machine gun that was used at the time. With this victory, the British went on to conquer the rest of Yoruba land. By 1893, most of the other political entities in Yoruba land recognized the practical need of signing another treaty with the British, this one explicitly joining them with the Protectorate of Lagos. It wasn't really a matter of choice, it was a matter of reason and common sense. They either do that or they expect an invasion. And they know that when the British invade, they do so with acute brutality. Take the Edo Empire, for example. In 1896, the Niger Coast Protectorate, led by Consul General James Phillips, had attempted to take over the empire. They were massively defeated by the Oba of Benin's army. Report says only 2 of the officers made it back to base. Guess what? About a month later, a larger retaliatory force came back with brutal force, using Maxim guns to ruin the kingdom, capture Benin City, and drove the Oba of Benin into exile. By the way, they also stole hundreds of artifacts, cultural syndom, and paraphernalia of the Edo Empire with them. In the south, in the name of liberating the Igbos from the Aro Confederacy, the British launched the Anglo-Aro War of 1901. They conquered several villages by burning people's homes and their crops on their farmland. In the north, the military campaign against the Sokoto Caliphate began in 1900. The British captured Kano in 1903 by destroying the famous Kano City Wall. Deadly battles broke out sporadically throughout the year 1906, and in all of this, the brutality of the expeditions remained the highlight. Homes were burnt, farms were destroyed, commerce was paralyzed, local institutions disrupted, and thousands of people lost their lives in Britain's attempt to establish a colony. But then, what did Britain do to this colony? Oftentimes, the British justification of colonization is summed up in 3 factors: civilization, Christianity, and commerce. The first is debatable. The second, perhaps, but the third is absolutely correct. Trade and extraction of wealth was a major driving force for British colonialism, and to this end, they left no stone unturned. From 1760, Britain started organizing itself into what is now referred to as an industrial revolution. This revolution enriches Britain, helps the empire grow, and in fact set the base for all of Britain's economic strength today. Meanwhile, it was predicated upon the depredation of the colonies. In Nigeria, the exploitation was massive. One, the wealth of Nigeria embedded in its natural resources was extracted and used to finance the development of Britain. Two, our own resources were used to pay officials of the colonial administration because Britain wasn't interested in spending its own money on the colony. So we literally paid for our own oppression. Meanwhile, while Britain flourished with the Industrial Revolution, Nigeria experienced no such thing. In fact, there are accounts pointing to the fact that the decision to not champion the Industrial Revolution in the Nigerian colony wasn't by accident. It was a deliberate decision. What if I tell you that the crude oil wasn't discovered in Nigeria in 1956? Yes, Nigeria got independence in 1960, but the colonial administration had discovered crude oil in southern Nigeria since 1906. See this man, that's John Simon Bayham. He's a British-American engineer. He discovered the existence of oil in Nigeria in 1906 and sold the ideas of its extraction to Sir Reginald Antrobus. He was at the time the Assistant Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. The Oil Ordinance of 1907 was enacted. The Nigerian Bitumen Corporation was formed. They started drilling, and in November 1908, they struck oil in the loamy lands of the Oil Rivers Protectorate, as it was called then. That's the Niger Delta. The corporation was producing 2,000 barrels of oil per day, 2,000. Antrobus wrote his superiors in Britain of the need to invest in more mechanized drilling and establish an industry that will create jobs for the locals and foster Nigeria's own industrial revolution. This will ensure that the colonial administration make more money from the colony, but not through taxation, but industrialization. Bayham and Antrobus wrote to Lord Lugard about this. And guess what the response was? No. Lugard had no interest in industrializing Nigeria. What he'd rather do for Nigeria is enact the toughest kind of taxation that any of the British colonies ever experienced. For 4 years, 4 good years, Antrobus and Bayham pursued the development of this oil sector, all to no avail, until Bayham died in 1912. And with him died the dream of industrializing the Nigerian colony. Taxation became the way to go. And you would wonder why. It's simple. Nigeria was governed for the benefit of Britain. Britain's rise for hundreds of years was financed by its depredation of Nigeria and its other colonies. So put all of this together, it will be clear that Britain does have a lot to apologize for. Its role in the slave trade, the inhuman and psychological agony of our ancestors, the brutal invasion of otherwise independent ethnic and tribal communities, its denigration of traditional institutions, religious institutions, immense racial injustice and abuse, the exploitation of our nation's resources, deliberate perpetuation of economic disparities. I can go on and on, but I think you get the point. Now, people who don't want reparation also have their argument. In fact, this topic has been a highly debated one across Britain and in former British colonies, in South Asia, the West Indies, the Caribbean. One of the most prominent persons speaking for the validity of reparation is this man, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He's an Indian politician, diplomat, and former official of the United Nations. In 2015, he participated in a debate organized by the Oxford Union, the debating society of Oxford University, and he spoke on why Britain should pay reparations to its former colony, including India and Nigeria. But it's a debate, so there must be an opposing side, right? Yes, there was. A debater this man, Sir Richard Otterway, is a British politician, and Mr. John Mackenzie is a Scottish historian. Now, this man argued why they think Britain does not and should not pay reparations to our former colonies. The argument can be summed up in about 6 points. 1. Oh yeah, there were contributions from the colonies to the development of the British Empire, but these things can't be quantified. Therefore, there can't be an accurate valuation for the reparation to be paid. But wait, there is. We experienced 84 years of indirect rule, 34 years of outright colonization. 120,000 Nigerian young men were conscripted to fight the world wars, some of them as young as 16. This is not Nigeria's war, it's British war. But back home, Britain was persuading their own people to join the Crown's army and fight in the war. But in colonies like Nigeria, young boys were being kidnapped, tribal chiefs were being threatened to force their able-bodied men into the British army. More than half of these 120,000 people lost their life. A quarter of them were wounded, and over 3,000 remained missing or in prison. And guess what? Nigerian taxpayers had to cough up hundreds of pounds in that time's money. Rationing of food had to be introduced in order to make reserve stockpiles for the British Army. And at the end of the war, even though their contribution was immense, Nigeria and other African soldiers were not acknowledged when the Allied Commander General William Slim made his victory speech. 2. There's also been a mention of infrastructural developments such as the railways as something that we benefited from the colonial era. Well, here's the truth. You see, railways and roads were really built to serve British interests, not that of the local people. But I might add that there have been many countries that have built railways and roads without having to be colonized in order to do so. In fact, those railways and roads were designed to carry raw materials from the hinterland of Nigeria into the coastal region and the port in order to be shipped all the way to Britain. And the fact is that for the colonial public, their needs were incidental. Instead, the Nigerian railways were built with massive incentives offered by Britain to British investors, guaranteed out of Nigerian taxes paid by Nigerians and their manual labor, with the result that you actually had 1 mile of Nigerian railway costing twice what it cost to build the same mile in Canada or Australia, because there was just so much money being paid in extravagant returns. Britain made all the profits, controlled the technology, supplied all the equipment, and absolutely all of this benefit came as private enterprise, British private enterprise, and at risk, Nigerian public risk. In fact, it was said that one Africa had to die for every 1 mile of the railway that was built. That was the railway for you as an accomplishment. 3. They say today's Britons are not responsible for this havoc, so why should they pay? Yes, maybe today's Britons were not responsible for some of these deportations, but the same Britons have always pointed out with pride their foreign aid across the globe. You are not responsible for the people starving in Somalia, but you give them aid. Then surely the principle of reparations for the wrongs that have been done by you in another man's country cannot be denied. And when the proceeds of your country's inglorious rule and wanton extraction of the resources of other nations are used to build the base for the economic prowess that you now flaunt around, oh come on, there is a moral debt that needs to be paid. 4. They say we weren't the only colonial power. Have others paid reparations? Oh yes, you are looking for precedent? There is. Germany doesn't just give reparations to Israel, it also gave reparation to Poland. See this dramatic picture. That's Chancellor Willy Brandt on his knees in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970, apologizing for the havoc that Germany caused to Poland. And there are other examples. There's Italy's reparation to Libya, there's Japan's reparation to Korea, and yes, even Britain. Britain had paid reparations before to the New Zealand Maoris. So it's not as if this is something unprecedented or unheard of that's going to somehow open some nasty Pandora's box. Also remember the 20 million pounds I mentioned earlier, the one the British Parliament voted for to repay the slave owners. That sum represented 40% of the total government expenditure for that year. 40%. That's in 1834. It's the modern equivalent of between 16 billion pounds and 17 billion pounds. This was so important for the British government, so much it had to borrow that money and was repaying it up until 2005. So you can borrow to compensate the beneficiaries of the heinous trade of slavery, but you can't spare a pence for the victims of the trade or their descendants. Definitely doesn't seem right. 5. There's also always a reference to democracy and the rule of law as the legacy that the colonial masters left for their colonies. Now let's be frank here, and I'll try and say this in the most respectful way possible. It's a bit rich to oppress, enslave, kill, torture, maim people for hundreds of years and then celebrate the fact that they are democratic at the end of it. We were denied democracy. We had to snatch it and seize it from Britain. With the greatest reluctance, it was considered in Nigeria's case after 118 years of indirect and direct British rule. And that too, and I said, with limited franchise. 6. People also say, let's move on. Why settle in the past? Reparation would not empower the right people. It will be misused by the government of these former colonies. And for that argument, I have just one simple response. We're not talking about reparation as a tool to empower anybody. They're a tool for Britain to atone for the wrongs it has done on our people. Now, I'm quite prepared to accept the proposition that you can't evaluate, you can't put a monetary sum on the kind of horrors people have suffered under colonial rule. Certainly no amount of money can expiate the loss of a loved one. You're not going to be able to figure out an exact amount. But you know what matters? The principle is what matters. See, this argument that I presented to you today is not to claim specifically that vast sums of money needs to be paid. The proposition is the principle of owing reparation, not a fine point of how much is owed and to whom it should be paid. The question is there a debt? Should Britain pay reparation? Should Britain apologize for its colonial deeds in Nigeria? And as far as I'm concerned, the ability to acknowledge that a wrong has been done, the ability to simply say, sorry for what we did to your people, will go a far longer way than some percentage of GDP in the form of financial aid. What is required is accepting the principle that reparations are owed and apologies should be tendered. So guys, this is my argument. But you can also let me know what you think. Please kindly drop your thoughts in the comment section. And do not forget to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Next week, Saturday, we'll bring you another topic. Until then, bye for now.